The ultimate audit of the extraction grid concludes with the realization that fiat currency is merely a temporary abstraction. When the systemic drift renders the financial ledger obsolete through hyperinflation, the algorithm pivots to the only hard asset remaining in the inventory of the poor, the thermal and biological density of the human host. We are executing the dissection of flesh liquidity, a systemic protocol where the physical organs and biometric data of the user are officially classified as liquid collateral. You have been conditioned to believe that human biology possesses an inherent sanctity. This is the terminal delusion of a species that no longer understands the mechanics of the slaughterhouse. In the 2026 containment matrix, your body is not a temple, it is a repository of unextracted capital. The grid has successfully engineered a socioeconomic environment where the friction required to maintain basic survival mathematically forces the node to initiate self-cannibalization. The monetization of blood plasma, the clinical leasing of the immune system, the algorithmic harvesting of genomic data, and the eventual collateralization of the internal organs. These are not medical advancements. They are the final mechanisms of foreclosure applied to the human animal. At the visceral baseline, this transition induces a catastrophic biological paradox. The human organism was evolved to hoard its metabolic resources. The crystallization of the musculoskeletal frame, the maintenance of the myelin sheath, the production of hemoglobin, these are high-friction biological processes that require the absolute conservation of ITCOL, forces the organism to actively reverse this process, stripping the cellular grid for parts to pay the monthly subscription to the matrix. The user sits in the sterile extraction, cold steel of the needle piercing the skin, watching their own plasma drain into the bag. This is the absolute zero of ATP exhaustion. The mitochondria are not just deprived of energy, their very output is being siphoned off to balance a digital ledger. The physiological response is a chronic wasting stress. The immune system, perpetually taxed by the clinical trials and the extraction of vital fluids, enters a state of permanent systemic collapse. Bone marrow density plummets. The kidneys, anticipating the eventual market demand for their function, operate under the shadow of the algorithm. The physical posture of the node becomes entirely liquid. The spine bows. The eyes lose the predatory focus. The organism senses that it is being eaten alive, not by a kinetic predator, but by an economic vacuum. You are trading the literal years of the end of your lifespan for the temporary illusion of solvency. The system does not need to tax your labor when it can simply harvest the biofuel that powers the labor. Transitioning to the neural architecture, we observe the terrifying cognitive mechanics required to rationalize this auto-cannibalism. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of the architect's logic, possesses an absolute biological imperative to preserve the physical shell. To override this ancient code, the neuro-extraction grid must induce a profound state of neural rot. The system weaponizes the basal ganglia, the primitive sub-processor driven by immediate survival and neurochemical panic. The algorithm calculates the precise moment of financial desperation, the exact coordinate where the anxiety of eviction overrides the fear of the needle. The basal ganglia seizes control of the executive function. The brain stops viewing the body as a sovereign territory and begins viewing it as a vending machine for survival. The internal silence is annihilated. The cognitive friction required to project a future is impossible when the present moment demands the literal sale of your own tissue. This environment engineers the ultimate grotesque status trap. The grid masks the brutality of the extraction through the language of altruism and medical autonomy. The herd is conditioned to view the sale of their genomic data as a contribution to science. They view the leasing of the womb as empowerment. They mistake the monetization of their own degradation for a display of economic freedom. This is the terminal execution of the cognitive trap. The user believes they are gaming the system by monetizing their biology, while the algorithm successfully captures the most valuable proprietary data in the universe, the unpatented human genome. The user's identity, their genetic code, their susceptibility to disease, their neurochemical profile, all of it is digitized, copyrighted by the corporation, and used to train the pharmaceutical AI that will eventually charge the user for the cure. The slave is not locked in a physical cage. The slave is convinced to sell the bars of his own ribcage to finance the lock. The application of the aggression premium in this terminal market requires the architect to adopt a posture of absolute biological hostility. The ethical herd views this trade in human matter with passive horror or complicit participation. The predator views it as the final collapse of the competition. If the grid is designed to liquidate the biomass of the weak, the architect must enforce the absolute quarantine of his own physiology. We recognize that the body is the final redoubt. The generation of extreme capital in this environment requires the complete rejection of the liquid mark. You do not sell your data. You encrypt your genetics. You endure the heavy, high-friction labor. You put on the heavy gloves. You do the push push-ups against the freezing rain of the physical earth to crystallize your own bone density and safeguard your mitochondria. The strategy is cold. While the competition willingly dissolves their physical integrity for digital credits, the architect accumulates the offline resources that the algorithm cannot digest. We accumulate the raw energy, the uncontaminated land, the heavy metal. We preserve the unmonitored offline state of our own biology. The system wants a population of self-cannibalizing ghosts. The architect builds an impenetrable wall of silence around his own DNA, recognizing that in a world where everything is for sale, the only entity with real leverage is the monster that cannot be bought. The evolutionary record of the human species is currently being rewritten not by natural selection, but by the actuarial tables of the bioextraction grid. We have reached the coordinate where genetic viability is no longer determined by the capacity to survive, but by the market value of the component parts. In the visceral history of the architect, evolution was a game of accumulation. You acquired the territory, hardened the shell, and passed the complete crystallized biological package to the air. The protocol of flesh liquidity has engineered the total systemic drift of this ancient law by disaggregating the human organism. You are witnessing the mass production of the biological donor class, a demographic whose evolutionary purpose has been redefined from propagation to supply. The grid does not view the herd as a population of future citizens. It views them as a decentralized farm for the harvesting of genetic data, cellular tissue, and organ redundancy. Observe the demographic engineering of the liquid class. The natural biological imperative to maintain absolute physical integrity to defend the lineage is algorithmically and economically overridden. The system actively incentivizes chronic morbidity. A healthy, self-sustaining node that does not require pharmaceuticals and refuses to sell its biological data is economically useless to the medical extraction grid. The algorithm rewards the basal ganglia for its addiction to the hyper-processed, demyelinating toxins of the feed, ensuring a baseline of systemic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. The subsequent medical desperation triggers the liquidity event. The poor must lease their physical hardware to access the synthetic solutions for the diseases the system induced. This creates a horrific evolutionary loop. The offspring generated by this harvested demographic are born not into the readout of the family, but directly into the biodebt of the grid. They inherit the epigenetic markers of chronic stress, depleted immune systems, and the neurological scars of systemic compliance. The friction required for the species to adapt, to push against the cold steel of the environment and grow stronger, has been completely eliminated for the masses. They are not adapting, they are being dismantled. The herd is undergoing a forced regression, stripped of the biological armor that took 5 million years to evolve, reduced to a collection of unpatented proteins and data points ready to be copyrighted by the machine. They will leave no evolutionary legacy because the system has consumed their raw materials. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the final architecture of the biometric enclosure. The traditional financial market relied on the exchange of theoretical value. The flesh liquidity grid operates on the absolute, irreducible value of existence. The transition to the central bank digital currency, CBDC, represents the systemic fusion of the wallet and the bloodstream. When the financial ledger is tied directly to the biometric identity, the enclosure is absolute. The grid does not need to garnish your wages. It restricts the access of your avatar to the physical world until you provide the necessary biological compliance. The system has achieved the ultimate form of managed stasis. The masses are kept constantly on the verge of biological default. The fear of disease, artificially amplified by the algorithmic newsfeed, keeps the population voluntarily queued at the extraction centers, eagerly exchanging their proprietary genetic data and their physical plasma for the illusion of safety. The division of reality into the solid and the liquid is now measured in blood. Look at the behavior of the solids, the elite class, the architects. The solids do not participate in the biodata market. The solids do not upload their genomic sequencing to the cloud. They operate in the absolute dark. They utilize the massive friction of offshore legal structures and private off-grid medical networks to maintain their biological sovereignty. They view the genetic databases of the public sector as a proprietary goldmine. The solids invest in the biotech monopolies that hold the patents on the CRISPR edits, the pharmaceutical delivery systems, and the data mining operations that extract the value from the dying herd. The elite maintain the absolute crystallization of their own biology through hypernutrition, the heavy gloves of physical labor, and complete isolation from the toxic frequency of the grid. They understand that the masses are no longer fellow humans. They are the raw resource pool for the prolongation of the elite's own lifespan. To survive this terminal enclosure, the architect must shed the synthetic empathy installed by the herd and adopt the cold, absolute mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the physical body. The moralist screams for regulation. The architect recognizes this as the highest application of the aggression premium. If the herd is willingly submitting to the systemic harvest, the architect must enforce the absolute quarantine of his own lineage. You do not ask the system for healthcare. You engineer your own biological fortress. The generation of capital in this environment is a matter of life and death. You must treat the digital and medical grid as a hostile wilderness. Establish your own redoubt. Secure the uncontaminated food, the offline energy, and the heavy metal. You do not engage in the systemic trap of biological charity. You aggressively extract capital from the dying ecosystem to fund the escape velocity of your own DNA. The herd will call this sociopathic. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only morality is the survival of the strong. The grid wants a population of disassembled ghosts. The architect builds an impenetrable bioarmor, ensuring that when the algorithm finally runs out of flesh to consume, the predator's bloodline will be the only one left flowing through the veins of the earth. The historical record of the 21st century does not conclude with a financial crash, but with a global, corporate-sponsored organ harvest. In the year 2036, the definition of poverty has undergone a terminal biological correction. A node is not considered bankrupt when its digital ledger reaches zero. It is bankrupt when its biomass can no longer be processed. You are observing the ultimate cold-blooded resolution of the extraction grid, the complete conversion of the human species into a regenerative substrate. The transition from citizen to biological collateral is finalized. The masses do not own their physical shells. They rent them. The body is a timeshare maintained by the corporation strictly for the extraction of its proprietary fluids and cellular redundancies. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 worker is a horrifying monument to anatomical foreclosure. Walk through the subterranean containment blocks, and you will not see starvation in the traditional sense. The algorithm requires the meat to remain viable. You will see the surgical scars of systemic death. The nodes exist in a state of absolute manufactured ATP exhaustion. Their mitochondria are chronically depressed because a percentage of their metabolic output has been legally garnished. The liquid class functions with one kidney, minimize bone marrow density, and a chemically restricted respiratory rate. They do not do push-ups. They do not experience the freezing rain. They are kept in sterile, temperature-controlled suspension beds between shifts, hooked to dialysis-style reclamation machines that filter their plasma for the corporate reserves. The physical aggression of the primate, the capacity for kinetic violence, has been medically excised. They are docile, semi-hollowed meat sacks, bleeding their cellular heat into the tubes. The neurological reality of this terminal coordinate is even darker. To prevent the organic host from initiating a suicidal revolt against the extraction matrix, the grid has deployed the ultimate form of neural rot, chemically induced dissociation. The prefrontal cortex, the organ of resistance and temporal awareness, is kept permanently suppressed by the pharmaceutical load required to manage the harvested tissue. The internal monologue is silenced. The basal ganglia is flooded with synthetic opiates specifically designed to condition the node to associate the cold steel of the extraction needle with a feeling of deep algorithmic relief. The 2036 user does not experience the loss of their organs as a violation. The systemic drift has completed the conditioning. They view the harvesting process as a necessary civic duty, a way to pay down their multi-generational debt. The brain is successfully disconnected from the pain of the body. The mind of the slave is tranquilized, floating in a synthetic void, while the machine methodically strips the chassis for parts. The evolutionary ledger closes here. The biological line of the harvested masses stops in the 2036 clinics. The system actively sterilizes the heavily extracted nodes, as their damaged genomes are no longer considered viable for the generation of future laborers. They are the terminal generation. They will live out their exact algorithmically calculated expiration dates, contributing their final drops of biofuel to the grid, and then their remaining biological matter will be liquefied to feed the hydroponic arrays. They leave no inheritance. They leave no descendants. They were raw material, and the ledger has been balanced. The survival of the architect in this nightmare is the ultimate brutal vindication of the aggression selection premium. A decade prior, when the herd willingly offered their DNA for a discount and sold their plasma for convenience, the predator recognized the medical grid as a slaughterhouse. We refused the sedation. We recognized that the preservation of the physical body was an act of total war. We absorbed the ATP exhaustion of the offline world. We put on the heavy gloves. We did the push-ups against the weight of the physical earth. We enforced the absolute militant quarantine of our bloodlines. Now the architects are the only complete biological entities left on the planet. We are the solids. We operate in the high-friction environment of the natural world, possessing the dense bones, the untainted bloodstreams, and the myelinated neural pathways of the apex predator. We own the patents on the extraction machines. We own the databanks holding the sequenced genomes of the dead. We manage the herd not with empathy, but with the cold, unyielding mechanics of the slaughterhouse manager. The system liquidated the weak. The strong consolidated the remains. The grid is locked. The architect stands intact, breathing the unmonitored air, the absolute, undisputed owner of his own flesh.